Magandang umaga po. I am Ron Mendoza, Dean and Professor of Economic Development at the Ateneo School of Government. My talk today is about cronyism and oligarchic behavior. Cronyism and oligarchic behavior thrives as long as governance systems and institutions remain weak and reforms have yet to be implemented. A market economy with strong competition and a level playing field, and a political system with genuine accountability and less dominated by fat dynasties are among the continuing reform aspirations to further strengthen our democracy and our economic development as a country. This presentation today draws on a discussion about Marcos-era cronyism, juxtaposed against the types of bad governance and corruption that we see today in the Philippines. And it is drawing on a corruption research documented by Rick Manapat in his book, Some Are Smarter Than Others, recently republished by Ateneo Press. My responses draw on my research on governance and anti-corruption, which were done with the Ateneo Policy Center and the Ateneo Policy Center. I hope these are useful for your discussions as we try to move our country forward towards better governance. Thank you.
By definition, the fall of a dictator should actually suggest that there is no single monopoly of power anymore. And so now I think is the more nuanced interpretation of what is happening to us. In fact, I would like to refer to a narrative shared by my good friend, Attorney Alex Lacson, who said that we were able to kick a dictator out of Malacanang, but we are unable to kick the many mini dictators in each of the provinces. And these mini dictators are actually the political clans, right? It's a nuanced interpretation of what's happening to us. We decentralize in a way some of the power. It ended up in some of our regions, in our provinces. But those provinces within their borders got quickly captured by very powerful families. And they are being contested by very powerful families. Not by powerful ideas, not by powerful reforms, not by credible political parties. They are being contested by powerful individuals and powerful families. So the system of governance actually is built around this contest. And this contest is not necessarily producing the inclusive economic development that we all want, nor the good governance that we all want. And certainly it's not producing citizens' empowerment. So it's important to say that these many mini dictators who are out there in the country, and they're seen in cities, they're seen in the countryside. The degree to which you can push back on them tempers their impunity. Our interpretation is that if you're in a city with an Ateneo, with the LaSalle, with the UP, with the UST, with the UE, with an FEU, these powerful individuals cannot just practice impunity. If you have media, if you have Rappler, well, we used to have ABS-CBN, not anymore. That's actually troubling. But if you have these institutions that can push back, you have business, you have church groups, you have civil society, then even though they have concentrated some power, they cannot practice the impunity that could be practiced in places like Maguindanao, or Lanao del Sur, or Sulu. And there, where you don't have the pushback, where you don't have the checks that we may have in the cities, in the more developed areas, where we have maybe the bigger middle class, then the risk of impunity is very, very high. So I think it's important to understand that it goes in layers. First is the concentration of power in a few political families. Then there is the absence of that democratic pushback. Then there is the opportunity for impunity that occurs. Now, the other side of the story, of course, is that you actually took out a dictator in Malacanang, but there are still powers in the presidency that actually help create some of the very bad relationships that we see, the bad governance that we see. And that's I'm referring to here is the pork barrel relationship that actually holds Congress back which is why every Congress and every president tends to be bound together in this. Well, essentially, it's a mutually enforcing behavior where the president needs all of Congress in order to get all that power, and Congress cannot really practice its oversight role because it needs the money and the resources. So that's the kind of bad governance and bad equilibrium that we have right now, that we hope through institutional reforms, through ideas like deep decentralization, dare I say federalism, but the right kind, not the bogus kind. We're actually envisioning rebalancing that power so that not everything is in the center. You actually have some agility in the local governments, but at the same time, with that agility, with those resources, must come accountability. So we must be able to hold them accountable also to what they're going to do with that additional power from the center. Well, I think that's essentially the innovation of every democracy that lasts, and that's the difference between a country that remains less developed and not really a rich and powerful country, and those that eventually make it to becoming a much more developed and much more stable democracy. I think there are many elements to this. Institutions, first of all, the first lesson I think I gather from international literature and international best practice is that institutions tend to reinforce each other. If they are good institutions, then they will reinforce each other in very good and stable ways. For instance, if you have an independent Congress, then the president will not make so many mistakes. And you may have good appointments, not bad appointments to particular agencies. And if there's any attempt at corruption or any attempt at impunity, the mere threat of Congress, the mere threat of the accountability mechanisms is enough to actually mitigate the worst of it. So that you actually have a credible threat as far as the accountability mechanism is concerned. So that's how good institutions sort of reinforce each other. Unfortunately, if you have enough bad institutions, they also will reinforce each other, right? So if you have a pliant Congress that doesn't really exercise its oversight role, then a lot of mistakes can happen in budget allocations, in major projects. And that there's going to be very little checks against a very powerful president. He could go on appointing, or she could go on appointing officers of the state with no or little expertise. And they would be not held accountable for their lack of expertise and lack of progress in terms of pushing the reform agenda, or maybe even having a reform agenda to begin with. So I think if you have that kind of an environment, and then when you see this, where loyalty is a primary consideration over expertise, over integrity, then everyone starts to behave to earn loyalty, which is the worst kind of behavior. I call it people auditioning to be noticed and appointed to positions of power. That kind of bureaucratic incentive is totally destructive and should be stopped, because the worst of us will actually rise. The worst of us will emerge to actually head many of these institutions. And given that kind of leadership, the rest of the bureaucracy will actually be discouraged. You will actually deter many good, talented young people from actually joining government. So that kind of an environment, that kind of decay, that kind of cancer, is the kind of decay and cancer that we saw under the Marcos dictatorship. So it's slowly coming back. We're seeing some of the signs, and we must put a stop to it. And I think there's enough of us on the checks and balances side to actually speak truth to power and actually try to stop it, also for its own good, because that is a very self-destructive tendency for some of our leadership and some of our institutions. So I think that's that's also what we need to work on. In fairness to our president right now, that is a very popular messaging, by the way, because it resonates with many, many individuals who see the inequality that is staring us in the face as far as this country is concerned. And finally, here's this leader who is not going to pretend. He's going to call a spade and say, I'm going to take down this particular family, this particular powerful individual, powerful company. The challenge with this, however, is one, we have heard this before. And if a head of state is indeed serious about taking down this pattern of power concentration, right? The focus needs to be not on individual families or individual companies, but on the system. Because the system keeps on producing powerful families and powerful individual companies. There's nothing wrong with a powerful company. There are many things wrong with a powerful single family, however. So that's the big distinction between. That's why I said to media that I think the oligarchs of this country today are not in business. They are in politics. And there is more money to be made in politics. That's why they actually migrated there. And now they are actually going after business, depressing some of these wealthy families, wealthy companies, and basically exerting their political and economic power even more, right? And I think the best way to think about this is to think of the system. The system is such that we allow them to concentrate power either on the economic side, on the business side, or on the political side. Now, let's start with the economic side first. If you are concentrating economic power, meaning wealth, meaning size, meaning reach, such as what some of our conglomerates now have. Personally, as an economist and as a development researcher who has seen the development of other countries, size is not necessarily a problem. The challenge is when you use that size to depress the growth of other firms. And you use that size to actually depress competition and protect yourself from competition. So the trick then would be, yes, let's allow you to reach some size, but guess what? Remember, we're going to expect you to export and duke it out with the rest of the big companies out there in the international arena. That is actually what the Southeast Asian and East Asian tigers did with their large conglomerates. That is why they did not turn out to be such big rent-seeking entities. The way to apply, to temper the power concentration in these particular firms was to force them out to compete. So it was the competitive pressure of the international arena that actually geared them towards the right kind of size, the right use of their size and power, right? So you need size to actually penetrate the US market, the European Union market, and the Japanese market. Because otherwise, if you're just a small firm, you will never get there. You'll never compete with their big firms, right? So size is forgivable on the economic side. You must be forced to compete. And if you cannot compete here in the country with 110 million people, compete out there in ASEAN where you have something like 800 million people. Compete out there in the North American and European markets where you have even more competitors to face. So that's the economic side. On the political side, I find it difficult to imagine how size can be good in any way. Because the way that size manifests itself in the political sphere is through fat political dynasties. You virtually occupy so many positions in office. And if that's what you're trying to do, some of them say that, Prof. Ron, you know what, with my father who is a governor and my sister who is a congressman, we can together do many great things for this province. And some of them actually start out that way. Let me give them a little bit of credit for that. But the thing is, that kind of concentration of power has no competition tempering it. That is the difference between the economic side, where you force them out to compete in the international arena. Here, in the political sphere, where in a province, give any Philippine province, and you have the governor, the vice governor, the mayor, the congressman, the provincial board member, all related in one political family. There is very little tempering of that power concentration, and therefore, the likely practice of impunity, where you are not going to be able to correct something that is already wrong, is very, very high. So that's the big difference between the two. So you ask me, okay, why are we seeing this all over again? Where the oligarchs, how can we actually address them? Well, if we are willing to apply competition on the economic side, let more players in, but regulate them. You don't just let so many Chinese investors in, but they don't practice good mining practices, or they don't practice good labor practices. Let them in, let the Europeans in, let the Chinese in, let the Americans in, but they follow our regulations. And the playing field is a level playing field. That's fine. But let's have more of them come into our country and apply competition to our own firms. And our own firms, let us actually give them the message and the incentives to go out there and find export markets for us. That's the first part. We've been actually doing some good in that area already. That's why we're seeing a lot of good economic progress in the past few decades. On the political side, applying more competition to the political system, that is where we're failing miserably and lacking still many political reforms that could actually push for competition in the political sphere.